you ever given something small away, only to realize later it meant the world to someone else? Out here on the forgotten edges of the West, where a warm meal can be rarer than rain, a simple act of kindness can ripple through lives you didn't even know existed. Stick around for this true-to-the-heart story of a wandering rancher, a hungry girl, and the quiet way strangers can change each other's lives forever. And hey, if you believe the smallest good deed can echo far beyond what we see, hit that like button and subscribe, because these are the stories we keep alive here on the forgotten frontier. The high country had that kind of wind that never let you forget how small you were. It came down off the ridges in restless sighs, tugging at the brim of a hat, chasing little eddies of dust along the trail. Thomas Grady had been riding through it for the better part of a week, his bay mare's steady hoofbeats keeping time with the thoughts rattling around in his head. At 44, Thomas wasn't old by ranch hand standards, but he carried himself like a man who'd seen more miles than birthdays. His beard was trimmed short, streaked with the kind of silver that didn't come from vanity, and the lines around his eyes had been carved there by years of squinting into sun and snow alike. He had no spread to call his own, no front porch waiting. At dusk, just a bedroll, his saddle, and a battered tin of coffee rattling in his saddlebag. Some years he worked a calving season in Wyoming, a branding season in Montana, then drifted south for the winter. Some years he never stayed in one place long enough for anyone to remember his name. That day had started before sunup, the way most days did for him. He'd watered the mare at a seep near the trail, then picked his way down toward the creek that wound through a tangle of willow and chokecherry. He figured he'd rest a while, let the mare crop grass, and make a meal before pushing on toward the next ranch where he might find work. From his saddlebag, he pulled a half loaf of bread wrapped in oilcloth and a small tin of beans he'd been saving. The bread was coarse and a little stale, the beans dented from being rattled around for days, but they'd do just fine with the creek water and a small fire. He squatted in the gravel, building a ring of stones for the pot. His movements were slow, methodical, the habits of a man who had learned long ago to stretch every minute of daylight and every scrap of food. The fire had just started to crackle when he felt it, that prickling sense you get when you're not alone. It wasn't the sound of a horse or the shifting of a big animal. It was lighter, more careful, like a coyote padding through brush. He didn't look up right away. Instead, he set the tin on the fire, letting the beans begin their slow simmer, and tore off a chunk of bread for himself. Then, as casually as a man might glance at the weather, his eyes flicked toward the far bank. That's when he saw her. She was just a slip of a thing, maybe 10 years old, maybe less, crouched low among the chokecherry branches. Her clothes were threadbare, the hem of her dress uneven, and her face was pale under a smudge of dust. She didn't move when their eyes met, just stared at him like a deer deciding whether to bolt. Thomas had seen hungry before. He'd seen it in calving sheds during hard winters, in mining towns after a strike ran dry. And he saw it in her, not the kind you fix with one meal, but the kind that sits deep in the eyes. He didn't call out, didn't ask her name or why she was there. Instead, he tore another piece of bread, this one larger, and set it on the rock beside him. Then he nodded toward it. The wind stirred the willows, carrying the smell of beans across the water. She hesitated, eyes darting between him and the bread. Then, as quiet as shadow, she slipped from the brush, crossed the shallow riffle barefoot, and stopped a few steps away. Up close, she looked even smaller, her arms thin as broom handles. She didn't say a word, just took the bread, clutching it in both hands, and backed away toward the bank. Before Thomas could say anything, she was gone, vanished into the green tangle, leaving only the sound of the creek and the faint crackle of his fire. He sat there, a long while after, the bread he'd saved for himself untouched. He stirred the beans, watching bubbles break the surface, and tried to shake the image of those pale wrists disappearing into the brush dot by the time the sun tilted west. He'd made up his mind. A man could ignore a lot out here. The miles, the weather, the way the world forgot your name. But there were some things you didn't ride past. He kicked dirt over the fire, packed the bread and beans into his saddlebag, and found the faint trail she'd taken into the hills. The mare snorted as they started up the incline, the path narrowing between outcrops. Somewhere ahead, there was a girl with hunger in her eyes, and Thomas Grady wasn't ready to ride on without finding out why the trail wasn't much of a trail at all. More a suggestion of one, a faint press of small footprints in the dust. That wound between scattered sagebrush and the pale stones that jutted like bones from the earth. Every so often, Thomas would lose it where the wind had brushed the ground clean, only to find it again where the girl's bare toes had left crescents in softer dirt. He wasn't in a hurry. Out here, you learned not to push your horse uphill, unless you had to. The bay's ears flicked forward, then back, as if she too sensed they were heading toward something unusual. The late afternoon light painted the ridges gold, shadows pooling in the gullies. A magpie flapped across his path, its tail flashing white, and disappeared into a cluster of cottonwoods where the creek narrowed again. It was about then that Thomas began to notice signs. Not the kind you see from the road, but the quiet traces of people making do where there's nothing much to make do with. A few cut willow branches, their ends sharpened. A length of old rope tied low to a tree, frayed where small hands might have pulled against it. Then he caught the faintest wisp of smoke. Not enough for a campfire you'd brag about, just a thin thread curling up into the cooling air. He guided the mare toward it, dismounting before the final rise. Some things you approached on foot, and this felt like one of them. From the top of the knoll, he saw it, an old army surplus tent, its canvas weathered to a dull green-gray, pitched in the lee of a rock outcrop to break the wind. Around it, the land sloped down into a hollow that held a fire pit lined with stones and a couple of battered tin pots. Near the fire, crouched low on a blanket, was the girl from the creek. She was tearing at the bread he'd given her, sharing it out between 3 smaller children, 2 boys, one barely more than a toddler, and a girl who might have been 6 or 7. Their hair was the same shade of dark brown as hers, their faces drawn and pale. A woman sat nearby, knees drawn up, watching them. Her hair was long but unkempt, threaded with early gray, and her face carried that hollow look Thomas had learned to recognize long ago, the look of someone balancing between hunger and sheer willpower. He stepped down slowly into the hollow, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The mare followed a few steps behind, head low, reins trailing. The woman saw him before the children did. Her shoulders tensed, one hand shifting toward the youngest as if she could shield him with her own body. "I'm not here to trouble you," Thomas said, his voice low, even. Saw the girl by the creek. Thought maybe there was more to it. The older girl, Rose, though he didn't know her name yet, stood quickly, the rest of the bread still clutched in her hand. She glanced at her mother, who gave the smallest shake of her head, then stepped in front of her siblings. Thomas stopped a few paces away. He reached slowly into his saddlebag, not for a weapon, but for the rest of his food, the beans, the bread, even the small packet of jerky he'd been saving. He set them down near the fire pit, close enough for them to take without stepping closer to him. The woman's eyes followed his hands, then lifted to meet his. They were wary eyes, but not unkind, the kind that measured a man's intent before deciding whether to trust him. "You don't have to," she said. Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't spoken much lately. "I know," he replied, "but I will." The children's gaze darted between their mother and the food. The younger boy's lip trembled, the smell of jerky clearly winning over whatever shyness he had. Rose didn't move at first, but her grip on the bread loosened just slightly. Thomas didn't linger for thanks. He just gave the mare's lead rope a light tug and turned back toward the ridge. Behind him, He thought he heard the sound of paper tearing, the bread being divided again. And under that, the faint scrape of a tin being opened at the top of the rise. He paused and looked back. The woman was still watching him, one hand resting on her knee, the other lifted just slightly in his direction. Not a wave exactly, more like a silent acknowledgement. He touched the brim of his hat in return, then stepped out of sight. The ride back to the main trail felt longer somehow, as if the hills themselves were holding him back. He'd left them, all the food he had, which meant he'd be making do with nothing more than creek water and coffee grounds until he found the next settlement. But the thought didn't trouble him as much as it might have a day ago. Men-like, Thomas didn't get to play the hero, not in any story that made the papers. But there were moments, quiet ones, when you could choose to leave things a little better than you found them. That night, he camped near a stand of pines, the wind sifting through the needles like distant surf. As he rolled his blanket out, he wondered how long they'd been up there in that hollow, how many meals they'd skipped before the girl dared come close enough to watch him eat. He also wondered if the food he'd left would last them more than a day. Probably not. Sleep didn't come quick. And when it did, it brought dreams of small hands clutching bread, of a woman's steady, guarded gaze. The next morning, with frost still silvering the grass, he cinched the mare's saddle and pointed her back toward the hills. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. Thomas rode back the way he'd come, the mare's hooves making soft thuds in the damp earth. The morning air had that clean, sharp smell that only came after a cold night, when the sky was still pale enough to make you squint toward the horizon. He didn't have much with him, just a fresh sack of provisions he'd bought from a little trading post off the main road, flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and a small sack of apples that cost more than they should have. He'd also picked up an old wool blanket from a barrel-marked clearance, figuring it might not be much, but it'd be warmer than whatever threadbare covers they had. He could have just left the supplies in the hollow and been on his way. That would have been the easy thing, clean, without having to answer questions or get tangled up in someone else's troubles. But Thomas had learned something over the years. Sometimes the easy thing wasn't worth a damn. When he crested the ridge above the hollow, the sight below was near the same as before. The army tent sagged slightly in the cold air. The fire pit was smoking, thin tendrils curling upward. The children were huddled near it, their hands spread toward the warmth. Rose was there too, crouched low with a stick, prodding at the embers like she could coax them into giving more heat. Her head snapped up when she spotted him. She didn't smile, not yet, but she didn't bolt either. The woman stepped out from behind the tent flap, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Her hair was damp from washing, combed back in a way that showed the hard lines of her face. She looked tired, but there was a steadiness in her eyes. "You came back," she said. "I did." "Why?" Thomas dismounted, loosening the cinch on the saddle. "You still hungry?" That earned the faintest ghost of a smile, though her lips didn't quite curve all the way. He set the provisions down near the fire pit. Rose's eyes went wide at the sight of the apples, and one of the younger boys made a small, sharp sound in his throat. "They'll last you a while if you pace him," Thomas said. "Blankets for the little ones. Nights are still cold up here." The woman looked at the pile, then back at him. "We're not beggars." "I didn't say you were." He poured himself a cup of water from his canteen. "Call it a neighborly gesture, even if I don't live close enough to be one." There was a beat of silence, the kind that could tip either way. Then she crouched and began unpacking the flour, the pork, the beans, movements quick and efficient, like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "I'm Mary," she said without looking up. "Thomas." They talked little after that. The children dug into the apples, their faces sticky with juice, while Mary boiled coffee over the fire. She offered him a cup without asking if he wanted one, and he took it, sitting on a flat rock a few feet away. The warmth seeped into his hands. the bitter taste waking him more than the morning air had. "You from around here?" she asked finally. "Not exactly. Just passing through, like always." She studied him for a moment. "Drifter? Guess that's the word for it." Rose sat beside her mother, still watching Thomas with that same wary expression. He had the sense she'd been watching people for a long time, measuring them, deciding when they were worth trusting. "You ride alone?" the girl asked. "Mostly. That lonely?" Thomas sipped his coffee. "Sometimes, but lonely ain't always bad. Gives a man room to think." She seemed to consider that, then looked away, tossing her apple core into the brush. He didn't stay long. People living rough didn't need strangers hanging around, even well-meaning ones. Before mounting up, he nodded toward Mary. Creek still running strong down below. Might be worth filling some canteens. She gave a small nod. "Thank you." It wasn't just for the tip about the water dot by the time he reached the ridge. The sun was slipping lower, shadows lengthening across the hills. He figured that'd be the end of it, just another brief crossing of paths in a life full of them. But the next morning, as dawn broke pale and cold, he found himself riding back. No real reason. Just something in him that wanted to see if they were still there, still holding on. He arrived as the first light touched the rocks. Mary was standing outside the tent, a small shape against the goldening sky. She was holding one of the apples, the skin polished bright. The children were still asleep inside, their soft breathing visible in the cold air. Rose sat by the fire pit, staring into the embers. Thomas didn't speak. He just swung down, reached into his saddlebag, and pulled out the last of the biscuits he'd been saving. He set them on the flat stone by the fire and stepped back. Mary's eyes followed him, her face unreadable. Then, as he turned to go, she lifted her hand, slow, deliberate, fingers spread against the rising sun. Not a wave. More like a blessing. A silent gratitude that didn't need words. Thomas touched the brim of his hat. The old felt rough under his fingers. Then he swung into the saddle and rode toward the horizon, leaving the hollow behind. Out here, folks came and went. Sometimes you crossed paths only once. But every now and then you left a piece of yourself in the hills, tucked between the rocks and the wind, and knew it'd be safe there. That was enough. If you liked this story from the Forgotten Frontier, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next tale. Out here, you never know who you might meet by the creek.